I've borne the pain. I hear the voice of my pride in the rage. Much too long it's been in its grave. So look hard, here I come. Look hard, so you know that I'm the only one. Look hard, here I come. Look hard, so you know that I'm the only one. Won't let grass grow under me, no longer just a memory. So look hard to recognize.
My family lived in Arnold Grove in the 1940s. The Liverpool Blitz was terrifying, and I will never forget as a child the drone of sirens and approaching bombers. The Grove was a really neighbourly place, and we were always in and out of each other's homes. What was strange for me was the music coming out of the house of number 12, the home of the Harrison family. George's mother, Louise, loved to listen to Indian music on the radio. I'm told that it helped to keep her calm during her pregnancy.
When I first heard Indian music, I just couldn't really believe that it was so great. And the more I heard of it, the more I liked it. And it just got bigger and bigger like a snowball.
One day the telephone rang and my father always answered it. He had a particular sort of authentic Indian accent. His Indian accent had remained unchanged in all the 40 years he'd been here. And he was shouting down the telephone, "Ringo who? Ringo who?" And apparently it was because Ringo was on the other end of the line asking my father whether he had a spare sitar string.
The return of the heroes to their native land. They conquered the colony. The Beatles, who originated as a small-time act out of Liverpool, now have no rivals as the kingpins of the teenage set.
The group have certainly turned Liverpool into Britain's answer to any pop trends from across the Atlantic.
On every side, there is hero worship that recalls the heydays of Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra. Beatlemania has ceased to be a phenomenon and seems to have become a way of life.
My father had never heard of the Beatles, so he knew nothing about anything European or popular. But what happened was that they'd broken a sitar string while George was recording Norwegian Wood in Abbey Road studio. EMI knew my father because he was often the person they came to when they required a group of musicians. So when the string broke, they phoned my father, and he did have one, amazingly. He did have a set of sitar strings. So the whole family got in the tiny little car, and they all drove to carry one string to Abbey Road. And there they handed it over, and they watched them recording.
It started with the Indian music. I like so many Indian instruments, but mainly sitar. I'd used a little sitar on our records.
The Beatles had already discovered Indian music, I think, when they were making Help, which is, of course, the story of a mystic Eastern religious group, and they are after Ringo Starr's Ring. So they had already discovered, and there's that famous scene about them going into a restaurant.
On the set of Help, a sitar was used in a sort of little group that's playing in the restaurant. George picked it up and was playing with it and sort of got interested in the sitar because of that.
It was a very inappropriate film for most Indians because that film really lived up to all the stereotypes about India, about bloodthirsty thug cult. The goddess, which was named as Kaili, was really based on a real goddess, the Kali goddess. Hindus are very reverential to her. So the whole film would be offending a lot of Indians. And then there was this book on the yoga. While they're on shoot at Bahamas, they suddenly come across this very diminutive yogi who cycles up to where they are and distributes this book. This is Vishnu Devananda, the first illustrated book on yoga going across the West. But I don't think the Beatles paid him much attention. I think much later they thought back and there was this sort of very mysterious connection.
The Palace of the Queen has lived through many historic events, and it's our privilege today to witness one of the most earth-shaking, the Beatles. Fresh from an audience with the Queen, they hold medals, indicating they have been made members of the most excellent order of the British Empire. The Beatles, of course, have proven to be one of Britain's prime exports. They have brought in more foreign exchange than many industries, and the Queen saw fit to reward their economic contribution to the nation. The award entitles the Beatles to put the letters MBE after their names.
That was the most miserable time of our lives, was the MBE cop-out period. We got MBE, which is one of the biggest jokes in the history of this island, probably.
The great cavalcade of empire makes a grand spectacle. One of the smallest countries on the map is responsible for the mightiest commonwealth of nations in history.
India was always in British lives because of the empire. We knew about tea and we knew about, rubber. But the idea of its music being in any way an influence on anything from this country was simply not considered.
From the music that I play, to get better and better, musicians generally in the West progress into, say, modern jazz. But when I first heard Indian music, there was so much more freedom and there was so much more in it compared to jazz. And I just couldn't really believe that it was so great. I don't know, then I just started to listen to it more and more and to try and listen a bit closer. And the more I heard of it, the more I liked it.
My mother meets the Beatles in India well before I'm even born. I think she, by virtue of being in the Hindustan Times at that point, being a preeminent journalist, being a chief reporter, got the opportunity but didn't really see, my God, the magic of that moment. And I'm always asked, what's the one thing about your mother that you would have really wished you would do? And she's been India's first woman war correspondent. She's done all kinds of crazy trailblazing things. And I always look at this photograph and I say, my God, I wish I had been that person sitting between John and Paul.
This was the first time the Beatles had, as a group, come to India. And they symbolized to us not just a new kind of music. It was almost like symbolizing a new kind of life. It was, they represented the whole 60s to us. When I heard they were in Delhi, I went to the Oberoi Intercontinental and I sat in the lobby and everyone was circling all the different entrances of the hotel, waiting for the Beatles to come out by the kitchen entrance, by various ways. I sat near the lift and I waited for Brian Epstein to emerge because I knew he was their manager. And sure enough, after a few hours of waiting, I saw him come down and I sidled up to him and I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Epstein, I am from All India Radio. The government have scheduled an interview with the Beatles." And he stopped in his tracks, he looked at me, "How dare you? The boys will not give an interview. How dare you?" I said, "Sir, just conveying the decision of the government, because this interview has been announced and it would be very embarrassing if this didn't happen. He said, I will not permit this. He said, well, I will give the interview. I said, good enough for me, sir. Brian Epstein, good enough for me.
Is there going to be any change in the sort of work that they do? Possibly, because, as I've said before, there's no dynamic or important change, but the Beatles have always progressed, and to progress, you have to change.
At 7 o'clock, I go up in the lift, I get out and I walk to the end of the corridor. I knock, and there's Brian Epstein in a bathrobe, sweating. He emerges, walks me across the length of the hotel, opens the suite door on the other side of the floor, and there I was, in with the Beatles, all four of them. I asked them what they were doing, and said they had an album coming out in a month's time. George Harrison mentioned that he had an Indian influence in one of the songs, which turned out to be Love You Too. And Paul mentioned that he had a classical arrangement behind one of the songs, which I think must have been Eleanor Rigby. Even then, there were going to be Indian influences in their songs.
I personally hope there'll be more Indian influences in, just generally in any music, because it's worth it. It's very good music. I'd just like to see it more popular, more people appreciating it.
It was the 6th of July, 1966. Some foreigner came. They never knew what the name of the person were, but they were interested in buying some sitars, harmoniums and tablas and sarods, and that's all. The huge crowd assembled here outside, looking the new face of the English people, like the big hairs and all that. It was a craze. My father and uncle went to the hotel and shown instrument, and later on gave lesson to George Harrison especially. After the Beatles, there was a big craze for sitars, tablas and other instruments. In a day, in a month, we were selling sitar like hotcake.
The famous Beatles, they came in 1966 to our store. They were dressed very differently so that the people, they could not recognize them. And they walked into the store and they started talking about Indian musical instruments, especially the sitar, the tanpura, the sarod, and also the tabla. He was a good sitar player, my father, and he was showing them how to play it and how the finger movements are, how to coordinate both left and right hand, and and how to strike the strings, how to plug the strings. They asked him whom he learned the sitar from. So he said, Pandit Ravi Shankar.
Pa, 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 pa. Like it.
See, Ravi Shankar, as I see it, was really the first ambassador for all musicians, artists, singers, dancers from India to the West.
Over the last few years, I heard the name of Ravi Shankar mentioned. A good friend of mine told me to buy a record, which I did. This was the first time I'd ever heard Indian music properly. But when I first heard it, I couldn't believe it really.
He was also being turned on to Ravi Shankar by like David Crosby and Roger McGuinn from the Byrds, because Ravi Shankar had appealed to the sort of the beat generation, going back to the 50s actually. It was all part of that kind of ambience.
I'm sure you must have been asked this lots of times before, but what's your opinion of sort of English pop groups and American pop groups using sitar and the Indian influence in their records?
It will make me very happy if I see that some people take true interest and learn properly. Because after having played the sitar for 36 years, I feel that one has to give some time to it.
Indeed.
My father and my mother were running the Asian Music Circle. My father was quite successful at getting musicians to come to this country, and he'd put on concerts for them. It was very much for erudite English people, intellectuals who knew about Indian music. Yehudi Menuhin amazing man. He was the president of the Asian Music Circle, and I think it was through him that Ravi Shankar first came. And George was fascinated by our family, and so he was invited round to spend the afternoon. I think he came round for lunch. Patty was there as well, and then George came quite regularly. Eventually, I said, if we could get Ravi free, and the time when George was free, we'd invite them both together and introduce them and see whether they got on. And the doorbell rang, and I rushed to the door. And it wasn't George, it was Paul. And Paul said, I'm Paul McCartney. And I said, I know. And he came in, and a little while after that, I think George arrived next.
And finally, we met very nicely at somebody's house having dinner. We met just as two people instead of being a big publicity gimmick.
Ravi came in, and we just said, Ravi, this is George. George, this is Ravi. And we had a dinner there. We just ate and talked. Paul was a little bit on the outside, actually, looking a little bit bored, smoking like a chimney. My young sister went around collecting the cigarette butts to take to school the next day, the used cigarette butts.
And from then, he offered to start me off on sitar with a few lessons, which he did.
He had many students in India, very talented musicians. So to try to explain what drew George and Ravi Shankar together is not easy, because it defies logic.
When George Harrison came to me, I didn't know what to think. But I found he really wanted to learn. I never thought our meeting would cause such an explosion. That Indian music would suddenly appear on the pop scene.
George said that I want to learn the sitar. And Raviji said, yes, I can teach you, but it's a very difficult instrument to learn. And you will have to spend a lot of time, and your fingers will hurt. It's going to be a difficult thing for you to do. But I want you to come to India, and I will teach you over there.
So when Ravi invited George and me, I was thrilled to be going. You know, 22, I hadn't really thought much about it. I thought of King's Road and, clothes. And we started off in Mumbai. Ravi took us to concerts, private concerts that he gave in people's houses, and then bigger concerts in front of his students.
George Harrison came with his wife, September 1966. Pandit Ravi Shankar picks him up, he takes him to the Taj Hotel, and within about 4 hours, the whole of the Apollo Bandar and Taj, it was just filled with people and media and fans just coming in shouting, George, George, George. So finally, George got just fed up, and he told Pandit, let's give a press conference, let's go and talk to the press. So of course, Pandit Ravi Shankar was the music director of All India Radio for many years, so he said, let's go and do a radio interview. Studio One, this is where Pandit Ravi Shankar and George Harrison did an interview. So we searched for it, and we actually opened quite a few spools, dusty spool lying in the side of a corner, and then we found George Harrison. There was a paper inside. It said George Harrison interview. The tape hadn't been played in maybe 30 years.
Good afternoon, George.
Good afternoon.
We would like to know from you, do you think you could not make a public appearance?
If I did want to make a public appearance, I would have come here to do a show, and I would have come with John and Paul and Ringo. It's just like all our fans who go to school during the week. Well, if they go on their holidays and suddenly somebody making them learn maths and learn English and learn all this, then they don't like to do that when it's their holiday. It's the same for me. I go around having my photograph taken, signing autographs and waving at people and being a Beatle. And when it comes to my holiday, then naturally I want to not be a Beatle, I want to be me.
When I was 19, I went to India. My aunt greeted me at the airport and said, do you know that George Harrison is staying at the hotel? We asked around, you know, where's Mr. Harrison, and we weren't told. And then sort of hopped onto the elevator, and we started going to floors. And then eventually there was one floor where there was a waiter standing outside a room. And I don't really know what made me do it, but I sort of hobbled in. And George Harrison asked what I was doing there, and I just said, I would like your autograph, Mr. Harrison. And he said, you know, he wasn't too happy about me being there. I also said to him he had numerous fans outside the hotel, and his words were, which I've never ever forgotten, tell your friends if they like me to keep away from me, which I thought was rather nasty, but I needed the autograph.
Everything that Ravi had shown us and told us about and introduced us to made an impact. He took us to the Ellora caves, fascinating. And we went to Benares, Varanasi. Benares was unbelievable because we came by boat, and Ravi had explained to us the whole reason for people coming to Benares to die, and they would request that they be burnt. And I was fascinated by this. The pyres, and then the family or the wife or the husband taking it into the Ganges and letting the ashes float away. So Agra, we went to the Taj Mahal. Beautiful. I love the story surrounding it. It was more exquisite than I could ever have described to anyone. And then, towards the end of our trip, Kumbh Mela. There were all these sadhus walking down the road. And I said, Ravi, what are they doing? Where they going? He said, they walk hundreds of miles to come to this Kumbh Mela. And I just watching this spectacle, and all these people, you know, families or groups and sadhus, all of India, it seemed. He also told us about Indian culture and spirituality. Ravi took us to meet his spiritual guru, and this man was over 100. And obviously we didn't know what they were saying, but it wasn't very many words. And Ravi was very reverential towards his guru.
Throughout my life, I look to the great yogi, Tat Maharaj, my spiritual guru. As a Hindu, I believe blessing of guru is the most priceless thing in life.
It was very moving for me to see somebody as powerful as Ravi. But George adored him, and he was humbled in front of his guru.
Raviji said that there was something that I found in George where he was so simple, so down to earth. He looked upon me like a guru, like a father, and he had absolutely no airs about him. And that is something that we also observed.
That's true.
When he came to our home. He was absolutely a simple person, not demanding anything.
I haven't learned to play the sitar. I mean, Ravi Shankar hasn't learned to play. He's been playing it 35 years.
He was not a star sitar player or a star musician, but I've not seen Raviji have so much time for someone. This association, this link, I can only explain it, that they must have had some links in a previous life that brought them together.
When George and we got connected in '66, it was like wildfire, you know. He was like son to me.
Sometimes I feel like his dad as well, though. He can be...
George Harrison. He loved India. He loved Indian music. He loved Indian spirituality. So this thing, you know, pushed Indian classical music on the top. You know, fusion, we can call it. Western and Indian classical music. And that was the biggest fusion ever happened. And then Harrison came here to record Wonderwall with Indian classical musicians. He was interested in meeting local musicians. The Beatles used the sitars in their records. Somehow we were able to imagine the Beatles as
our band, as an Indian band.
You know, India was a closed society and a closed economy, and it was not very easy to get your hands on albums. In 1962 or very early 63, on the international shortwave, a group of people in Bangalore heard their music and said, hey, wait a minute, this is very different. What it did really was to liberate an entire generation from the cultural shackles of the past. The British had left in 1947. This cohort was born in the late 40s or early 50s, mid 50s. When they came of age, they rejected the past and embraced the new.
In those days, most of the musicians were really from the Anglo-Indian Catholic Christian community, because they were the ones who were more trained in English. The Jets was really the first beat band. It wasn't so much rock music, but it was known as beat music. And the word beat was not far from Beatle. We started to model our lives along the lines of what the Beatles were doing at the time. The musicians those days were more into singing Jim Reeves, Everly Brothers, Pat Boone, and then bang came the Beatles. And it was like an electric breath of fresh air. Whatever we were used to suddenly lost its relevance.
One day we just woke up and we saw an image of the great Shami Kapoor with that Beatle wig in a Hindi film that spoke about the enormous power and the clout of the Beatles.
My mother was an Indian classical musician, and then she bought me my first 45, which was I Wanna Hold Your Hand. Straight away, and she bought me a British pop magazine where I could read about what was happening in the UK and, you know, the UK pop scene.
One day, one of my classmates came back to India after the holidays, and he brought an album by the Beatles, who we'd never heard of. By 10 o'clock that night, I'd fallen in love with the music, because I'd heard it 3 or 4 times. That music grew into me, and I thought, wow, this is fabulous.
We used to play those records again and again and again. You know, somebody is listening to the words. You know, somebody is trying to figure out the chords.
Yes. And the solos.
Yeah, and the solos. And the most difficult part was the harmonies. Beatles still remain one of the greatest, you know, harmony groups, you know, ever.
We went to Calcutta. We stayed with a friend, and the first night he took us to a restaurant called Trinkers. But when we walked in, we were dressed in our Beatle clothes, and everybody got up and started clapping. I don't know why, maybe they assumed we were some famous group, but we weren't. But the owner of the restaurant said, hey, you know, the people want to know if you guys sing. I said, yeah, we sing. He said, would you do a couple of numbers? So we did She Loves You and Please Please Me. We brought the house down, shook our heads, etc., etc. The owner came and he said, would you guys like a residency? And that's how our career started.
We were the first Western music performing group to be ever recorded in India at the HMV studios. And the songs, if I am not mistaken, there was a song called Pain and The Girl Next Door. I think The Girl Next Door had some influences of the Beatles.
Especially the harmonies.
The harmonies, yeah.
I was planning to go west because, you know, forget the Indian culture. The Western culture was what we youngsters wanted. By some strange paradox, the Beatles, who lived in the culture I wanted, were making their way to India.
LSD was really beginning to make its mark in London, in the circles that they moved in.
Some newspaper man came up and he said, have you had LSD? So I thought, well, I'll either be cagey here or I'll be honest. So I said yes.
Oh my God, well, I mean, the first time was when George and me, John and Cynthia, were invited for dinner by our dentist. And that was a bit scary because you know what was happening to them. You know, I mean, it's just everything is surreal. And you look at your hand and you're like 500 years old. And then I'd hear my voice and wonder where it came from. And colours, and there's an intensity to it.
When we took the notorious wonder drug LSD, we had it and we went out to a club and it was incredible.
When I got onto acid, right, you know the day that you're at 100% potential and you can handle whatever the situation is. With acid, or just after acid, the percent of good days as opposed to bad days was just a bit better, you know.
They particularly got into drugs and Indian music at the same time, and it seemed like there was some kind of a connection between the two. There wasn't, of course, because they both pre-existed separately.
There must be an intimate connection between Indian music and drugs, maybe because of the bizarre sound, and there should be a drug connection. He said that that's how
I'm sure you call him bizarre, Dick.
Yes, I object to the word bizarre.
Or not, I meant B-A-Z-A-A-R, the other... no, wait a minute, there's no way I can get out of this. To Western ears, the unusual sound might suggest some sort of chemical intoxication.
I'm not blaming George, but somehow because of him, the sitar became really popular among the young people.
The hippies were the ones who caught on to Indian music, and it just happens that most of them were, out smoking pot or something. And since then, the two got caught up together, but it's really a problem.
I request my listeners to be in a clear mind, because I like to put them, make them high.
Yourself?
With music. Yes.
Yeah.
And I feel rather cheated when they're already high.
LSD opened them up to experiences and awarenesses of consciousness that they wouldn't have got in any other way. Eastern religion, I think, would have been opaque to them. They wouldn't have been able to understand it at all. But having had that experience, suddenly these things made sense.
George said that when he first took LSD, he heard voices in the back of his head saying yogis of the Himalayas.
Maharishi, good evening. You once said even if only 1/10 of the adult population meditated for short periods each day, it would not take more than a few months to remove the entire accumulation of tension in the world.
I am absolutely convinced
yes.
about it.
I saw an advertisement in the paper for transcendental meditation classes, so I went with a girlfriend.
England I have been visiting once every year. People do feel stress and strain due to the greater undertakings in their life.
Paul phoned George and said, there's this man called Maharishi who's going to come to England and talk about meditation. And I said, oh, that's the same guy that, I follow. So in those days when one Beatle did something, they all did it. So we all went.
Now, you've been traveling the world now for many years. You've made, I think, something like 8 world tours. You
Ninth, I returned this time.
This was the 9th completed.
Maharishi was the most powerful, magnetically charismatic person I've ever met. He was also the happiest person I ever met. He was filled with this energy that you wanted to be near him all the time. All of us who were on his staff, we fought each other to get into the room with him.
It was just the right time, anyway. There were we waiting for someone.
Waiting for a guru.
The great magic man to come. And he came, there he was. He was talking about it all. And he had great answers. Because he's got that kind of thing, And he sort of, the twinkle in the eye.
They told Maharishi that they'd been seeking a spiritual experience. They'd been trying to do it through drugs, but it just didn't work, And so he invited them to come to Bangor, North Wales, where he would be doing a meditation retreat for 10 days.
Among your supporters now, how do you feel about that? They seem to be very intelligent and alert. So you think that if the Beatles adopt your teaching, then they can spread it amongst other young people in England? And much more easily, not only England, but throughout the world. Because the word Beatle has gone on in all the continents, and younger people are fascinated by that name. What do you think of the Beatles? Very good, intelligent young boys, and there is a great potential. And their music? Music I haven't heard, but because they are appreciated all over the world, they must have something very grateful in their music.
I think he's trying to say is the things we're getting into aren't that important. Money has taken over from God. Instead of trying to get where God is, we all try and get the biggest bank balance. That's what it seems to me.
The mind is like an ocean, very deep. And the activity is only on the surface like that. So if the waves of the ocean contact deeper level of water, then the waves become stronger.
That means that we're going to be happier.
And much happier and much more creative also.
He was found in his second-floor bedroom just after 2 o'clock this afternoon by his housekeeper. Mr. Epstein has been unwell now for some months. And he's been in the habit of taking tablets to help him sleep at night.
When Brian died, the Beatles clearly were lost. They were like Jelly, their manager, their best friend, their man who they rely on totally for their fame, for their fortune, you know, their guide in life, was now gone.
John, where would you be today without Mr. Epstein?
I don't know.
I understand that Mr. Epstein was to be initiated here. When was he coming up? Was he coming up in the afternoon?
Tomorrow, just Monday, that's all we knew. I spoke to him Wednesday evening, the evening before we first saw Maharishi's lecture, and he was in great spirits.
I wanted Maharishi to bring him back to life again. You know, by this time I'd given him so much power, and how extraordinary that they were with Maharishi, who was now going to be sort of their spiritual guru, but also that they could lean on him because they trusted him so much. So for that moment in time, he replaced Brian.
I understand that Maharishi conferred with you all.
He told us that, not to get overwhelmed by grief, and to whatever thoughts we have of Brian, to keep them happy, because any thoughts we have of him will travel to him wherever he is.
I come to India because of I want to leave material world, come to a simple country. Ganga is a holy river because it comes from Himalaya, and this place has much energy. When it comes down, no? It takes energy and it comes here.
The ashrams, or monasteries of the various religious orders, glimmer over the smooth green water. Though the sun is hot, the river is icy, flowing from a glacier high up in the Himalayas, the land of the gods. But Rishikesh, its name means place of the wise ones, is far from being a remote or desert region. It's one of the most celebrated centers of pilgrimage in the whole of India.
In the cool, clear air of Rishikesh, North India, the meditation retreat of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Flower-loving yogi told reporters that his brand of peace of mind could only be truly appreciated by intelligent men of the world with rewarding activities and high incomes.
The purpose of life is the expansion of happiness. Anyone can find the way. That's the basic teaching of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Are the Beatles really going to find happiness here in Rishikesh? Are they really going to become, as Maharishi hopes, the practical philosophers of the age? Or must they return home unsatisfied, the eternal rich young men, victims of a fad, looking for something, anything, to make their lives worthwhile?
I was a reporter. I had heard that the best thing that a reporter can do is to beat all the other reporters in getting to the news. A friend of mine read the Beatles were coming to stay with the Maharishi. And he said, Said, do you know what it means? The whole world and its media is going to be here. The idea is to beat them. How do you beat them? I said, the idea is to become a disciple. If I become an insider, I I'll get the story. So I walked in. You had to make some excuse if you're a drug addict, if you had failed, if you're a junkie. He whispered a mantra, a chant in my ear, which I'm not supposed to share with anybody. Then I went in and again, until all the sadhus who were going to be his managers recognized me. The password was Jai Gurudev. You said Jai Gurudev and you were in. From Hardwar to Rishikesh, across Lakshman Jhula, I was taken aback. It was like a locust storm. Journalists after journalists after journalists, hundreds of them. What's going on? They are not letting us in. I said, they are not letting anybody in.
Overnight, I went off to Rishikesh. There were quite a few people from all over India. And it was very difficult to even know where the Beatles, where the ashram was, because it was so fortified. Fortified in the sense that, you know, there were a lot of police, there was a lot of bandobast in there. The whole day we would just early morning wake up, somebody said, hey, the Beatles are coming to the Ganga. And so we'd all rush up there and wait there for 2-3 hours, but nothing would happen, you know. But it was like a celebration. It was like an exhibition. You know, there was so much of joy.
One day, Maharishi called me in and he said, the Beatles are going to be arriving in a few days, but I want you to go fix up their rooms. They put me in charge to make their rooms nicer. I would have them paint this. They dropped so much paint on the floor, then they'd have to paint the floor. Anyway, we had curtains put up, we had mirrors, we even had toilet fixtures that worked. They had mattresses on their beds.
There's a fan club of real Beatles waiting to welcome them. But the hardest thing about the life they'll lead here are the beds they'll sleep on. A hard wooden base, a simple rather than a Spartan existence.
When they did arrive, he introduced them to me and said, if you want anything, get a hold of Nancy. Nancy will be my ears and eyes. In case you need anything, let me know through her.
So I wound my way and I went to the gate and I said, Jai Gurudev. I was in. Oh, there was a commotion outside. How did this bastard get in? I said, I'm just a devotee of the Maharishi. So anyway, I entered, and there, under the tree, Maharishi, George, John Lennon, Paul, their respective ladies, a whole galaxy. I mean, I can't keep describing them. I need a photograph. So I called the sadhus. I said, look, I'm having difficulty managing this on my own. I immediately assumed the role of publicity manager for the Maharishi. So I said, here's a name, Raghu Rai. You go outside, call him in.
This man came who was from the ashram and he says, Mr. Naqvi wants to see you. I said, give me 2 minutes. So I went in, I put a big zoom lens on my camera and put it inside my labada. So when I'm walking, nobody can see if I'm carrying a camera. So I walked with him for about 8-10 minutes. One sadhu was standing there. Sayyid was standing next to him. So Sayyid said, look there. I was shocked. Then I turned around and I saw that guy sadhu standing next to us. I said, Bhai Sahab, badi pyas lagi hai. Ek gilas pani pila dijiye. So he goes to get a glass of water for me. And Sayyid says, hurry up, hurry up. In those days, we didn't have autofocus, auto exposure cameras. So you had to set the focus, set the exposure, everything. And I take just one picture, nicely focused and proper. Under the tree, Mahesh Yogi and the Beatles.
बदल जाता है। तो जब ब्रिटिश आए तो उनका पूरा इंतजाम हमने किया। जब मालूम हुआ कि वो आ रहे हैं तो उनका रहने का इंतजाम, उनका खाने का, वो सब हम करते थे और हम ही सारा इंतजाम करते थे। कच्ची चीजें जैसे कच्चा पत्ता गोभी, टमाटर, सलाद, ऐसी चीजें ज्यादा पसंद करते थे और पानी की जगह कोका कोला बहुत पीते थे। में उनके ऊपर था, लेकिन उन लोगों ने बहुत सीखा। फिर हम लोगों से हाथ नहीं मिलाते थे। हाथ पहले तो उन लोगों का प्यार करने का तरीका फर्क होता था, लेकिन हम लोग क्या रह के वो सब कुछ। अब महर्षि जी के यहाँ जब ध्यान करते थे, बैठते थे, खाना खा के जाते थे, आदत थी कि कमर में हाथ डाल के हस्बैंड वाइफ हमेशा ऐसे हाथ करके खड़े हो खाना खाए। वो भी उन लोगों ने देखते देखते सब कुछ। बहुत अच्छा खाना और कल्चर। हम लोगों के यहाँ हस्बैंड वाइफ के बीच में चाहे जितनी वो हो, लेकिन फिर भी अलग रहना, अलग तरह से बिहेवियर ज्यादा पसंद किया जाता है। फिर धीरे धीरे करके उन लोगों ने बहुत कुछ सीखा हम लोगों से। और जैसे हम लोगों की जिंदगी थी, खूब प्यार से बोलना, नमस्ते, हमेशा नमस्ते करते थे।
See this building. This is the building where they lived. This room, I would show you this side. This is the room of John Lennon. John Lennon would stay here. Other Beatles were staying in these rooms along with their wives and family.
So when Beatles came, I was a little kid. We were enjoying the whole atmosphere and the jungles and Beatles and Maharshi ji. We were very close. We never find that he's a celebrity or some big thing. We should not go near him. So this was the place where Maharshi used to converse with Beatles and guests. Straight we can see River Ganga, clear water and forest. There was a raised platform, rectangular shape. He was usually posing with the visitors and Beatles for the group photographs.
ये महर्षि महेश योगी का आश्रम है, ये उनका घर कहिए। तो यहीं पर जब बीटल्स आते थे तो यहीं ध्यान होता था। कभी तो वो अंदर करते थे, लेकिन ज्यादातर ये खुला जो मैदान है इसमें बीटल्स ज्यादा पसंद करते थे, खुली हवा में बैठ के ध्यान करने के लिए। तो वो ज्यादा अच्छा मानते थे। कभी छत पे ये कहीं जाके ध्यान नहीं हुआ।
Maharishi's disciples can wander in peace amongst the trees and bungalows or meditate in some quiet spot overlooking the Ganges. He doesn't require you to give anything up except drugs and a week's salary. In the Beatles' case, around £11,000 apiece.
What exactly have you been doing? How do you meditate? You sit down, you relax, and then you repeat a sound to yourself. And it sounds daft, but it's just a system of relaxation. And that's all it is, you know, there's nothing more to it.
By expanding the conscious capacity of the mind, mental capacity will be stronger, thought power will be great, and when the thought power is great, then the thoughts will find their fulfillment more easily.
You go into those interstellar spaces, where the spaces ultimately shrink into your being. Now, this gibberish goes on and on and on relentlessly, and you have these people close their eyes, and the more unintelligible it gets, the more profoundly affected they pretend to be. Because I can't really imagine anyone being moved by words which are patently and absolutely absurd. His lectures were in the nature of this kind of arcane nonsense. Nothing succeeds like success, and it succeeded.
Are you a businessman?
I don't deal with money directly, but I'm conducting the movement in 50 countries. I can't be said to be no businessman, even though I'm not dealing with money.
I was a young girl, 21 or 22. So there I was in this beautiful ashram. I was taken to meet the Maharishi. He asked me to come close to him. I did, too close in fact. He said, I'm going to whisper something in your ear, the mantra. And then he said, I want you to go down into my prayer room and I want you to concentrate upon that mantra. You're going to feel like a new person. And I actually believed that this was going to happen to me. It was a dark room, and there was some incense burning, and there were some things hanging on the wall. And I started repeating the mantra. I repeated it, and the only feeling that I remember, there was this intense, desire to escape from that place. I went near the Maharishi, and he said, how do you feel, my daughter? Do you feel like a different person? I said, actually, I don't. He looked at me, and he said, I'm going to whisper another mantra. Back you go. Repeat that mantra. You might have to spend a little longer. By now, I was in control. I repeated the mantra, and within half an hour, I came upstairs. I gave him a glorious account of how I felt like a totally new human being. I felt like a different person altogether. That was the only way to escape. And I walked out into freedom.
Maharishi really influenced the Beatles' songs and lyrics tremendously, starting with Across the Universe, which was written right after the Beatles learned meditation. In that song, it says, Jai Guru Deva, and Maharishi used to use that expression all the time.
Now once more, Vande Gurudeva, Jaya Jaya Gurudeva, Jaya Shri Gurudeva, Jaya Jaya Gurudeva. It is in praise of the Guru.
So John Lennon put that into the song, Jai Guru Deva, and then he said Om. And Om is the primordial sound that underlies and gives rise to the universe.
Just exposure to mantras. I mean, the idea was a repetitious sound could create an altered state of consciousness. And you get it in hello, goodbye, you get it in goo 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 goo. Repetitious sounds creeping into their songs, whether deliberately or not.
ये देखिए किनारा है, यहाँ पर महर्षि जी कभी कभी आते थे, लेकिन बीटल्स रोज आते थे बारी बारी। कभी कि अगर ऐसे बैठ जाइए तो पानी ऐसे ऊपर से चला जाता था, बहुत साफ पानी, इतना कि कुछ डालिए तो लगता उठा लेते। तो बहुत गहरा ध्यान करते थे। होते थे तो हम लोग यहाँ सब लोग बैठते थे और बैठ के गाना वाना गाया करते थे। हालांकि उन लोगों को हमारी भाषा नहीं समझ में आती थी, लेकिन फिर भी देखिए हम बताते हैं कि हमने उस समय क्या गाया। हम जो गाते थे, बनवारी रे जीने का सहारा तेरो नाम रे, मुझे दुनिया वालों से क्या काम रे, बनवारी रे, झूठे बंधन झूठी दुनिया, झूठी है ये माया, झूठी सास का आना जाना, झूठी है ये काया।
I lived for 3 days in a cottage at a camp in Rishikesh, just 100 yards from the Beatles. I remember sitting around a bonfire at night with the Beatles and Mike Love of the Beach Boys and Donovan and others singing and playing the guitar. It was a cold, cold evening, and at some point I muttered to the person next to me, "I'm freezing." A man seated just ahead of me, wrapped in a huge brown-gray blanket, heard me. He said, "Move up, love. Come and share my blanket with me." It was George Harrison. I should have said yes, but by then I had successfully cultivated an air of nonchalance. I looked at George like he was a nobody and replied, "No thanks, George, I'm fine." 4 regrettable words that I could never take back and that have haunted me all my life for what could have been but never was.
The person who was actually sincere about meditation, about Indian culture, Indian music, was George Harrison.
Maharishi said, of all the Beatles, George is the most advanced, and this is his last life.
George wanted to understand why he was chosen to be famous. He found curious that he, a boy from Liverpool, who otherwise would have had a very menial job, was selected and was famous, and he wanted to know the answer.
Really, the only reason to be living is to have complete, full knowledge, full bliss consciousness. Everything else is just mundane and secondary. The purpose is to transcend from this relative state of consciousness to an absolute state of consciousness.
Maharishi said, John Lennon has many more lives to go, and he must not give in to his weakness for women, or it will ruin him.
Keeping company with himself, it could be part of the treatment, John stalked along the shady paths.
John Lennon, when he first arrived, he was gray, he'd been heavily into drugs, he just looked awful. And then, little by little, you saw the change that came over this man. He had pink cheeks, he started to be very sociable, he was out playing his guitar, chatting with other people, and he was having such a lovely time.
Meditation worked all right, you know. You could handle each day better than I could handle it before. I was meditating for 8 hours a day and things like that. And it was really some trick, like acid was nowhere, you know. Just sitting there muttering some word in a room. It was the biggest trip I've ever had in my life, you know.
Ringo is always in meditation, and he goes by feeling and heart, whereas the other Beatles, too much brain is in the way.
Ringo enjoyed the peace of togetherness with Mrs. Ringo. It was a very peaceful scene.
Ringo Starr. 2 or 3 days he sees all this and he declares it's like a butler in holiday camp, and disappears. He left. And then there were 3.
Ringo and his wife Maureen stayed at the ashram for 10 days. Ringo's allergies caused problems with the ashram food. He was allergic to so many things that he took 2 suitcases to India. One had his clothes, and the other one was stuffed with cans of Heinz beans. But the primary reason that Ringo and Maureen left was because they missed their kids.
Maharishi, I thank him, you know. All the time I thank him for giving me what he gave me. So I'm glad I've got it in case I ever want to go into it again. You know, you can't lose if you learn something.
Maharishi wanted to take them off on a trip to the Himalayas. A company ran these helicopter services.
I always wanted to become a pilot. I became the chief pilot for the Maharashtra government. And I flew everybody, including the Prime Minister often, and Indira Gandhi also, and the Beatles. Paul kept on saying me, because he wanted to get in. And John said, no, me. And anyway, finally, John just pushed him aside and went in. I'm flying John on my left and the Maharishi on my right. And the Maharishi leant across me. As you know, he had a lot of hair and beard. So difficult for me to fly the helicopter. He was telling John, down there in the mountains, people live there. They never go down to the valleys. And they're praying all the time. So John said, what are they praying for? So the Maharishi said, they're praying that we crash. And John said, goodness, why do they want us to crash? They said, well, they're on the mountain top, there's hardly any food. And I'm in Rishikesh with all these celebrities there and all the money in the world. So John said, Maharishi, if you don't move your head and half, their prayers will be answered. And of course, I started laughing and everybody did it. He had a sense of humor.
They were visiting Dehradun, George, John and Paul. He said this Saturday they are having celebrations in the ashram to celebrate the birth of George Harrison's wife. If I could bring some other musicians along with me, they'll be very happy. So I told him, okay, I can arrange it. So we all sat down, Maharishi gave a lecture, and then I was asked to play. There was a composition by George Harrison, Within You, Without You, which was based on Rag Jog. So I decided to play that. And George was so excited about it that when I smiled and he smiled and he waved at me. At that time, Nick Nugent went with me. Nick was a visiting teacher.
Now tell me, where did that famous photo of us, was it in the middle or was it over here?
Here.
Okay.
In this alley, in this wall.
I have such vivid memories of that birthday party where so much music was played, so much glamour. Patty Harrison there in her mauve sari. Part of our mission was to bring her George Harrison's birthday present to her, the Dilruba. It was so relaxed. Coming from Britain, the Beatles were impossible to see or touch or reach. And here it was a completely different atmosphere. They were absolutely natural, all the musicians there. I think I spoke to Donovan, Mike Love, Paul Horn, and of course Paul McCartney, Jane Asher, John Lennon. I don't think I spoke to George Harrison because he was so tied up in both the occasion of his wife's birthday and also the music. He really was playing music and enjoying music and absorbing Indian music. There was no pretense about it. He was completely hooked. The music started off being very Indian and played on Indian instruments, but then you could say it deteriorated into a birthday party with the Happy Birthday song and the British national anthem for some curious reason. As the evening went on and perhaps people got a bit fidgety, we went outside and enjoyed fireworks. Of course, I went away feeling that perhaps the meditation was all a bit of a lark because they enjoyed themselves so much in the evening.
Now, George Harrison was thinking mostly of playing better, serious music which belonged to the world. But John Lennon was a serious human being. He was not very talkative, but his thinking was very beautiful. I was slightly more fascinated by John. They gave me so much respect, you know. They treated me very well. They called me sir, and I was feeling strange, you know. I told them, don't call me sir. No. For us, you're sir. They could not have seen me at all. There was no need to, but they did. Success had not gone to their head, you know. They were simple human beings.
We came up the path here, we were killing time, and the Beatles, meantime, had come back to their bungalow, and they were on the roof. Not just the Beatles, but many of the musicians were on the roof of the bungalow playing music. And it's the most memorable thing of my day here, was hearing this music, which was, of course, unrecorded music. It was just being
created at that time. And we felt we were in there, witnessing the first time round, the first version of this music.
The word was coming to Maharishi that they had suspended their meditations and that they were sitting and composing music and things.
We were there for about 6 weeks, and during that time, there was no pressure from the outside world. There was no pressure of them being Beatles, and their creative juices just overflowed. They wrote all the songs for the White Album. They worked out gradually what they wanted to do the rest of their time as Beatles.
Other than when they're in the studio, they didn't get to spend a lot of time together. So in India, they were suddenly together like sort of mates again, so they could sit out and play in the way that John and Paul used to play in the council house where Paul had grown up. And you've got Mike Love from the Beach Boys is there, so they've got that whole tributary of American music that had influenced them. And Donovan with his kind of folk tradition, and Paul Horn, who was a jazz flautist, he was there too. So you've got a lot of interesting sort of streams coming in.
I'll show you the stairs here. They'll sit here on these stairs. Here was one bamboo structure here as a fence those days. They'd come and they would make new songs here, staying here, sitting on these stairs. In that side, Prudence were living. Maharishi told her to be inside, stay with their practices.
Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence, is way ahead of anybody else. As soon as she entered her thing, she went into meditation, and this she has not emerged. It's already 24 hours. So she's serious.
They would invite her outside. Hello, Prudence, come out, Prudence, and she won't come. And then they made a song, Dear Prudence.
I think one that's kind of interesting is when I came back from a tiger hunt with my eldest son. When we came walking in, he said to Maharishi, I shot a tiger today. Is that bad karma? Sitting there observing this was John Lennon. And John said, you don't call that slightly life-destructive? And I said, it was the tiger or us.
Maharishi glared at Nancy the whole time they were talking about it. Life destruction is life destruction. End of story. That's how the song, The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, originated. It was John's answer to Nancy's paltry excuse.
Because Mike Love was there and they knew the Beach Boys music, and there was this kind of friendly rivalry of them wanting to top each other. But back in USSR, it's just like a parody of a Beach Boys song, but instead of being about the USA, it's about Russia. And it was a very novel idea at the time to think of a rock and roll song that appeared to be celebrating Russian culture and had all these Russian names and Russian places being mentioned.
Opposition members today demanded an inquiry into Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, alleging that Rishikesh had become a center of espionage. The issue was raised by Mr. K. Anuradhan after a radio transmitter was found on a bus near the antibiotics factory in Rishikesh belonging to a foreigner.
The furor broke out in Parliament. It was led by the communists, backed by the socialists, and they said that there was a CIA camp in the ashram, and the Maharishi were getting all these foreigners, including the Beatles, to destabilize India.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
This was exactly the time when Indira Gandhi was making friends with the Soviet Union.
Today we're going to show you cases of attempted espionage by agents of the Sino-Soviet intelligence system. You recognize the way a Sino or Soviet agent operates, both in finding someone vulnerable to subversion, as well as in their technique of ensnaring him and applying pressure to get him to play ball.
the KGB sent their top man in India, Desmanov, to the ashram to check out the Maharishi.
My function was to discover what kind of people attend this school. Yes, there are some influential opinion makers who come back with the crazy stories about Indian philosophy. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a great spiritual leader or maybe a great charlatan and crook, depending on from which side you're looking at him. Beatles were trained at his ashram. Mia Farrow and other useful idiots from Hollywood visited his school, and they returned back to United States absolutely zoned out of their minds with marijuana, hashish, and crazy ideas of meditation.
Maharishi used to always say, you can never create peace through signing treaties, through legislation, through any kind of external means. The only way to create world peace is for people to meditate.
See, if you carefully look, what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi is teaching is that most of the problems, most of the burning issues of today can be solved simply by meditating. Don't rock the boat. Don't get involved. Just sit down, look at your navel, and meditate. And the things, due to some strange logic, due to cosmic vibration, will settle down by themselves.
The single aim of spiritually regenerating every man everywhere in the world and creating peace.
You can get control of yourself just by sitting quietly and by turning off from the external problems we have and all this society. You can go inside yourself where it's always calm and peaceful.
This is exactly what the KGB and Marxist-Leninist propaganda want, to distract their attention and mental energy from real issues into non-issues, into non-existent harmony. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi obviously is not on the payroll of the KGB. But whether he knows it or not, he contributes greatly to demoralization of American society.
Paul McCartney and his girlfriend Jane Asher stayed for 5 weeks, and they left because Jane had a theatrical commitment back in London.
This presumably is your first big meditation, and what effect has it had on you?
I think it calms you down. It's hard to tell because it was so different, life out there. It'll be easier to tell now that I'm back and we're doing sort of ordinary things, to see just what it does.
They were 4 working-class guys from Liverpool. They had an innate sense of not being taken advantage of. So when they get together with Maharishi, Maharishi is inevitably tempted to capitalize on his sudden worldwide fame because of the Beatles association.
They realized that maybe Maharishi had been using them all along for publicity, ever since the final record that was by the Beatles' spiritual teacher, it said on the album. So John and George started to think something fishy is here, he's using us for publicity.
So they began to hear little bits of news here and there from the grapevine of, your Maharishi's planning this and planning that, and you're going to be in it. And they're going, are we?
Maharishi kept promising ABC that he would do a special with the Beatles. And the Beatles kept saying, we're not going to do this special. But Maharishi kept promising it over and over.
There comes a time in late '67 when Paul and George go to Sweden, basically to tell the Maharishi to cool it a bit, Don't start making plans that involve us without telling us first.
We're glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do appreciate your music. And that's good, yes?
The smell of the flowers. We only decided to come yesterday.
Yes.
Just to pop over to have a little chat.
Yes.
And when the Beatles were in Rishikesh, he, without their knowledge, was having discussions with a Hollywood film company called 4-Star International.
Maharishi promised them that they could have exclusive rights to make a film about Maharishi and about Maharishi's guru. But unfortunately, Maharishi made the same promise to someone else. He had given rights to 4-Star Productions. The lawyer arrived in Rishikesh with a signed contract They gave exclusive rights to film Maharishi for the next 5 years.
Some suits arrived from Hollywood and a crew, and John and George were going, oh, we didn't want this. We're here to meditate. We don't want these film people here. And there was a confrontation with Maharishi about, why are you doing this? We told you not to.
In any case, the Beatles became quite disillusioned about that. The film was really kind of a deal breaker, and they got very angry because they had been granted exclusive rights to do this film, and now another film company is there, so the whole thing just fell apart.
I don't know what happened. I still don't know, and I know there are many rumours around, but John said, that's it, we're going. But I know John wanted to come back to England and see Yoko. And so any little excuse, and John was ready to go, because we've been there for weeks.
Well, it was only John who was upset. John dragged George along. And I still think it was when Magic Alex came from the Apple Corps group.
Alexis Mardis was one of the Beatles' associates. In fact, he was very close to John. He had sort of attached himself to John's hip. And Cynthia really didn't like Alexis. She was very concerned about this Bengali influence that he was having on John. John had introduced Alex as my new guru. He was this electronics marvel, supposedly. He introduced himself as somebody who was like Edison and Marconi combined. But in fact, he was just a TV repairman.
We just got a friend of ours who's in electronics. Oh, yeah? Who's called Alex. And he's great, he's a Greek fella. And he's invented incredible things.
He was a minx, naughty little boy. You see, he wanted to have power over John. And so he would, create all these things, pretending he's a scientist. He said, oh, here's this wonderful new wallpaper, but it's all speakers. So the whole room will have these one big speaker. So he loved all that, controlling John. So clearly and obviously, Maharishi was in the way.
One night, John and Maharishi were having this wonderful rapport. And you know how you can see sometimes when a person lets the mask drop on their face? And I could see this really dislike of Maharishi on Magic Alex's face. It disturbed me enough that I felt that something was going wrong.
No one ever saw him meditating. And as a matter of fact, he admitted that he came to India for the purpose of getting the Beatles away from Maharishi. Alexis said, oh, it's because we don't want Maharishi to have that much influence over the boys.
I'm totally convinced that Magic Alex made a friend of one of the young women at the ashram, and he got her to tell John Lennon that she was having sex with Maharishi. It just horrified all of us when this whole thing happened.
I believe that Maharishi made a pass, and the reason I believe it is because he made a pass at many women that I knew. It wasn't the first or the last one.
Well, I remember Maharishi saying that, if you have an ugly woman over here and a beautiful woman over there, it's just easier for your attention to go to the more beautiful.
John and George didn't believe it at first, but finally Alexis convinced them and then went and got taxis for all of them before they could change their mind. While they were waiting for the taxis, John wrote, Maharishi, Maharishi, what have you done? You made a fool of everyone. The song had a lot of expletives in it, and George said, you can't say that, that's ridiculous. So John changed the lyrics to Sexy Sadie.
Yeah, Sexy Sadie, it was actually called Maharishi, and it was a put down of the Maharishi in very vicious terms. I don't think there's any chance of it getting out with the words that John had originally, but basically denounces him and says he was a bit of a rogue.
John dragged George along, and then he just bolted from the ashram.
I think Maharishi was a mistake. What do you mean it was a mistake? We made a mistake.
We thought there was more to him than there was, but he's human. And for a while we thought he wasn't, we thought he was...
trail.
The Beatles, they were opening us up to different experiences in various ways, you know, Indian philosophy and Indian music. And then when they went to Rishikesh, you know, it was the idea of Indian travel. It's like, well, looks nice over there, you know, they're enjoying themselves in the sunshine. There'd been a hippie trail, an embryonic hippie trail in the early 60s. A few people had gone out. The whole point being that you drove overland. The ultimate destination was, in fact, Kathmandu in Nepal. I'm sure the Beatles inspired lots of people to go, because this little trickle of people on the hippie trail beforehand suddenly turned into a flood.
Did you enjoy the trip over to India?
Yeah, the journey was terrible, but the trip was all right.
Yeah. There was a report that, now we get very bad reports. That you didn't like it, or you didn't have the patience, and you decided to go home.
We were there 4 months, so George and I were.
Did you think this man's on the level?
I don't know what level he's on, but we had a nice holiday in India and came back rested.
Maharishi looked visibly frail and without his usual effervescence. His brilliant and beautiful yogic radiance was reduced to gray and ashen. He became physically sick when the course moved from Rishikesh to Kashmir.
He's still a nice fella and everybody's fine, but we don't go out with him anymore.
When the Rishikesh experience finished, Paul, John and Ringo just kind of carried on, resumed with their lives. But for George, India was never a 5-minute thing. India was a lifetime devotion. And he wasn't just going to give it up because of the way that Rishikesh finished with a bit of a sour taste. India for him was something that he continued to push.
George didn't want to go back to London. George was still in meditation mode, and he didn't want to go straight back to see the press. So he said, let's go down to Kerala just for a week. And it was very calm then. And then, you know, he wanted to slowly come back into sort of business life, as it were, in London. Slowly, in his way.
I mean, because everybody all of a sudden became an individual. John, Paul, Ringo, and George. The Maharishi phase faded out, you know, but the Indian aesthetics and the etiquettes remained with everybody, using the influence of Indian music and the culture.
You know, when you look back at the Beatles' story on their return to the UK in the spring of 1968, there was still the camaraderie that saw them through the madness of Beatlemania, soon to dissolve as the fraught sessions for the White Album began. Working separately most of the time and not as a unit, and with Ringo quitting the band for a short period, remarkably, they delivered what many would call one of their greatest albums.
When the Beatles were in India, Maharishi told them if they don't continue meditating regularly, their band would break up.
Hold it. Now, does this mean a business or emotional split within the Beatles?
I should think a bit of both. Oh, it's probably to do with growing up and to do with... There was a time when there were just 4 of them, but now they're married and there are children.
I was born in 1971, same time around when Beatles broke up. I mean, even like, I guess it's about 50 odd years or something. It still sounds fresh. It sounds amazing. The world would have been like so shit without them, you know. The world is so much better to live in with that music around.
The songs that they made in India, in Rishikesh, I had no idea. And out of them, some of the songs like Blackbird, like Dear Prudence, like these are some of the songs that I used to perform in my old band in Chennai. To have known that they have written these songs in India just gave it so much more meaning, because I used to connect to these songs as a classical musician more than a person who loves English music.
I was born in 74. So for me to get to know the Beatles happened much later. We were not really born at the time when the dressing, how a Beatles haircut or the dress that they wore really attracted us. We didn't see that. We only heard the music. It's purely the music. It sounded very simple, very catchy, and it had a high recall. So whenever you heard a song, you would remember it. But when you sat down to work on it, to try and see if you can sing that song, that is when you realize the complexity of it. I don't know how it was appreciated when it was released, but it's something that is still relevant today.
They came to see in the fullness of time. In particular, in George's case, George discovered from gathering evidence what exactly happened at the end of their stay in Rishikesh and how Alexis Mardas, Magic Alex, had cooked up this whole thing.
George always loved Maharishi, and toward the end of his life, he went back to see Maharishi.
George said to Maharishi, "I came to apologize." And Maharishi asked, "For what?" And George replied, "You know for what."
Maharishi apparently said to George he believed that the Beatles were angels on earth and that they were not guilty of any crime themselves. So when George came away from that meeting, he felt cleansed of his guilt of the method of the departure back in 1968.
I got into India. I think that was the one thing in my life that I could have done without everything else, but that one thing of getting in touch with what's inside through Maharishi and Ravi Shankar and Indian music.
And as for the others, well, they all warmed again to the culture and the spirituality of India.
The only way we can change the system is by changing it non-violently, because they've done the violent kick for millions of years, you know. I think the only way to do it is Gandhi's way, and that's non-violent, passive, positive, or whatever they called it those days, you know.
John Lennon spoke kindly of Maharishi in other interviews. Ringo and Paul have both said the same. Everything became okay again in the end.
Years ago, we studied meditation with the Maharishi. He was one of the ones that wasn't a fake. There were a lot of them around that time who were into Rolls Royces and chicks. He wasn't one of them. I actually met him quite recently. He lives in the Netherlands now. And I took Stella, my daughter, and James, my son, with me. And he is a spry old codger. He's in his 80s, and he's still working, he's still going.
The day when the Mahesh Yogi died, there was a big storm. The water from the river Ganges came whirling up, and it showered in this bungalow. The local folks who came here to pay their tributes to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi were amazed to see this supernatural. It was the power of Maharishi which brought Ganga on this top of mountain.
When I first came here 10 years ago, this was just jungle, ruins and jungle. And you would sneak in through the back, there were cracks on the wall, and you would smoke pot and see leopards at night. This is what people did. So I take tourists into the ashram, I show them everything, and I'm trying to bring them back into 1968 and give them some of the experience of the Beatles here. Tourists that come here, they really appreciate it. They really appreciate to have the sense for the Beatles as a historical entity.
My experience when I went to the Beatles ashram was super magical. These huge superstars, you wouldn't really think that they'd go to a really simple, no-frills ashram in Rishikesh. The most exciting thing about music is the way that it has the capacity to shift cultural norms and expand people's minds. And in India, that's exactly what the Beatles did by bridging the gap between East and West in a country that was very much under this, dark cloud of colonial rule, which in many ways created a culture of apology for being Indian and a reverence for whatever was foreign. That what was so powerful is for the most powerful band in the world to come and revere our culture.
They had descended in our part of the country and they had embraced the spiritual narrative of India, and they had come to Rishikesh and there were images of them with Mahesh Yogi. And then suddenly we felt, look, they are one of us.
As kids, as Indian kids, we're always rebelling against our culture. And then you realize that like something that is so influential in pop culture took a lot of influence from India. My introduction to them was I happened to be part of the age of illegal downloading at the time of like Napster and stuff.
We used to have the White Album on CD. That was my first introduction to the Beatles. We still felt its influence even though we were born like in the 80s and 90s. India is considered this place where you could go for a spiritual awakening, for meditation. So I think the Beatles came to India to look for that, and in some ways they really did find that. I guess that's a small gift that India gave the world through the Beatles.
The happiest time in life, one of the happiest times, is in India. And it was just such a groove. It's such a pure thing. Everything is slightly more in perspective.
The whole of life should be a spiritual experience because we are spirits who are just encased in bodies. People forget that and think they're just this body, but we're actually spirits in bodies.